The conference room on the 14th floor of the Meridian Partners building had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced east over the Ohio River, and on clear December mornings the light came through them at a low, precise angle that made everything on the mahogany table look like it had been placed there deliberately, examined, and chosen. Nadia Calloway had been watching that light come through those windows for 12 years. She had chosen this building, this floor, this specific room, on a Tuesday afternoon in March when she was 29 years old and still running the company from a rented desk in a co-working space on 5th Street. She had chosen it because the eastern exposure meant you faced the morning directly. You could not sit at the head of that table and pretend the day had not started yet. She was 41 now, and she was standing at the doorway of that room at 8:52 on a Wednesday morning in the second week of December, holding the coffee she had made herself in the small kitchen at the end of the hall, and she was looking at the woman already seated in the chair to the left of the head of the table. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Avery Sinclair had her laptop open, a yellow legal pad beside it with 3 lines of notes already written in her careful, deliberate script, and a coffee from the shop on the ground floor in a cup with her name spelled correctly on the side, which was itself a small thing Nadia had noticed and cataloged without quite knowing why in the earliest weeks after Avery joined the company. The coffee, always there before anyone else, always the right temperature. The legal pad, the 3 lines already written before the meeting had a chance to tell her what direction it would go. Everything about Avery Sinclair had always been precisely calibrated, which was one of the things that had made Nadia approve her hire without hesitation 14 months ago, and one of the things that made this morning, this room, this particular Wednesday, feel so much heavier than any of the others that had come before it. Avery was 32. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back for board meetings and loose at client presentations, a distinction Nadia had recognized immediately because it was the kind of distinction she herself had made at 32, that small and practiced recalibration of presentation depending on the room and what the room required of you. She was good at her job. Nadia had thought so in the interview and had thought so at every quarterly review since. She had built Meridian's new business pipeline from essentially nothing into a forward book worth $16 million in advisory contracts over the course of 14 months, which was not a number anyone in the company had seen before, and which Nadia had told her, specifically and directly, at the September performance review. She had meant it. She had always meant the things she said to Avery, which was part of what made the past 3 weeks feel like learning the grammar of a language you had been speaking fluently for over a year only to discover it meant something different than you thought. Avery looked up when Nadia stepped into the room and offered the small, professionally warm smile she gave at the beginning of every board meeting. "Good morning, Nadia." "Good morning." Nadia set her coffee at the head of the table and pulled out her chair. Behind her, through the glass wall separating the conference room from the open floor, she could see the office beginning to fill. Paul Hendricks, their CFO, was coming down the corridor with his reading glasses already on, a manila folder tucked under his arm. Sandra from operations was pulling a rolling cart of printed materials. The 2 outside board members, a woman named Claire Firth who ran a commercial development firm in Columbus and a retired banker named Gordon Lee who had been on Meridian's advisory board since year 4, were visible through the glass in the small waiting area and near the elevator, talking with the ease of people who have known each other long enough to run out of small talk and arrived at something more comfortable. Marcus was not in the room yet. This was not unusual. Marcus was rarely in the room first. In 8 years of marriage and 7 years of working in the same building, Nadia could count on one hand the number of times her husband had arrived to anything before her, and most of those occasions had been early in the marriage, when he was still establishing his habits, and hers hadn't yet made him feel like the one who was always catching up. She opened her portfolio to the agenda she had prepared the previous Friday. The items were organized in the order she had learned over 12 years was most productive: financial review first, while attention was sharpest, then operational matters, then business development, then any personnel or structural items that required the full board's input. She had built this agenda format in the company's 3rd year and had not fundamentally changed it since, which was one of those things she knew and most of the people in the room did not, because most of the people in the room had not been there in the company's 3rd year. She did not look at Avery again. She did not look at Avery for the same reason she had not looked at Avery, not directly and not for long. In the 3 weeks since she had sat alone in the quiet building on a Saturday morning and read 3 lines on a screen she had not intended to read. She did not look at Avery because Nadia Calloway had spent the better part of her professional life understanding the gap between what you felt and what you showed, and the two were separate things and had always been separate, and what she felt right now was not something she was prepared to bring into a conference room at 8:52 in the morning. She turned to the first page of the quarterly financial summary, which she had already reviewed twice, and drew a small check mark next to the revenue projection column. Then she sat back slightly in her chair and let the room settle around her. She had always been this way, going back further than Meridian, further than Marcus, further than any of this. Going back to a girl doing the household accounts at the kitchen table in her parents' house in the West End of Cincinnati, learning before she was 12 that numbers, unlike most things, did not change their meaning depending on who was looking at them. Her father's name was Eduardo Torres, and he had run a small general contracting business for 31 years without ever growing it beyond 12 employees, which was not because he lacked the capability, but because he had made a deliberate choice in the company's 7th year that scaling meant managing people he didn't know well enough to trust, and Eduardo Torres did not do things he didn't trust. He kept his accounts in a blue ledger that he maintained by hand and balanced to the penny every Friday evening at the kitchen table, and when Nadia was old enough to sit beside him and follow along, he let her. Not because he needed the help, because she wanted to understand, and he believed that a person who genuinely wanted to understand something deserved to see the actual thing, not a version of its simplified past recognition. Her mother, Rosa, had done the bookkeeping for Eduardo's company and for 2 other small businesses in the neighborhood, working from a desk in the corner of the dining room where a window overlooked the back garden. And she had done it with the particular combination of accuracy and speed that comes from years of doing something properly, until properly becomes the only way you know how to do it. Rosa Torres had never finished her accounting degree, having left in her 2nd year to marry Eduardo, and she held this not as a wound but as a fact, the way certain women of her generation held the shapes their lives had taken, with a clear-eyed acceptance that did not require you to pretend the shape was the one you would have chosen. What she had given Nadia instead was the watching, the careful, unhurried attention to how things worked, not just the surfaces of things, not just how they were presented, but the underlying structure, the logic that held them up. Rosa Torres read a balance sheet the way she read a person's face, looking not for what was there, but for what was conspicuously absent, what had been smoothed over, where the numbers told a story that the words around them were trying to complicate. Nadia had absorbed all of it, the precision from her father, the reading between the lines from her mother. She had grown up in the West End at a time when the neighborhood was doing the same thing it had been doing in one form or another for 40 years, which was surviving the specific kind of institutional neglect that gets renamed and repackaged by city governments every decade without changing its essential character. She knew the school at the end of the block. She knew the community center that had its programs cut twice before she finished middle school. She knew the families who had been in their houses since her grandfather was young and the families who had arrived recently. And she knew the particular grammar of a place that has learned not to expect much from the systems that were supposed to be watching out for it, and has developed its own watching instead. She had been, by any measure she was aware of, a serious child. Not humorless, not cold, but serious in the way of someone who understands early that the world requires navigation, not passive occupation. She made friends at school, kept them through high school and some through college, and she was known among them as the person you went to when something needed to be figured out, not because she had all the answers, but because she had the patience to sit with a problem until its actual shape became clear. She had a gift for that, the stillness. The willingness to keep looking after other people had decided what they were looking at. She won a scholarship to the University of Cincinnati at 17. Her mother cried on the front steps when the letter came. Eduardo pretended not to and then cried later in the garage, which Nadia knew about but never mentioned. She studied architecture, then shifted to urban planning, then found herself sitting in on real estate finance electives during her 3rd year because she had a professor who kept referencing commercial development case studies, and she kept thinking that the most interesting questions in those case studies were not the design questions, but the structural ones. Not what the building looked like, but who owned it, who had financed it, what it cost, and what it returned, and who in the surrounding community actually benefited from any of it. She graduated at 22 with a planning degree and a minor in finance, and went to work for a mid-sized commercial real estate advisory firm in downtown Cincinnati called Hargrove and Wills, where she spent 5 years learning the business from the inside of a place that did it competently, but not brilliantly, that served its clients adequately, but without the specific attentiveness she had come to believe the work required. She learned everything she could. She took on projects beyond her job description when she could find a way to make the ask seem reasonable. She watched how the senior partners handled clients in difficult moments and noted, quietly, and without broadcasting her opinion, the places where she would have handled it differently. By the time she left Hargrove and Wills at 27, she had 2 things that mattered. She had a comprehensive knowledge of the commercial real estate advisory landscape in the greater Cincinnati region, and she had a small, devoted list of clients who had worked with her specifically and trusted her specifically, and whom she had, in the careful and unhurried way she went about most things, taken years to cultivate. What she did not have was money. What she got, in the spring of her 28th year, was $47,000. Her grandmother on her mother's side, Abuela Consuelo, died in April of that year in the same house in Oaxaca she had lived in for 6 decades, leaving a small estate divided among her children and grandchildren in proportions Nadia would never fully know the reasoning behind, and leaving to Nadia specifically, by name and in a separate notation in the will that the family attorney read aloud in a way that suggested he found it as interesting as they did, $47,000 in a handwritten note in Spanish that said, roughly translated, "She always looked closely at things. She will know what to do with it." Nadia had held that note for a long time. She sat with the $47,000 for 4 months. She did not spend it. She did not invest it. She let it sit in a savings account while she thought, not quickly, not with the rushed decision-making of someone trying to catch up with an opportunity before it closed, but with the long and thorough deliberation of someone who understood that the size of the decision did not necessarily correlate with the speed at which it should be made. In September of that year, she incorporated Meridian Partners. The name had come to her not as a flash of inspiration, but as the right word for what she was trying to describe. A meridian was a line that told you where you were. It was the point from which measurement proceeded. It was what you found when you needed to know your position in relation to everything else. Nadia had always thought that was what the best advisory work actually did. Not told clients what to build or where to invest, but helped them understand clearly where they stood, what they could see from there, and what stood between them and where they were trying to go. The first 2 years were the kind that do not make for a dramatic story because they are made almost entirely of small, accumulated effort that does not resolve into any single turning point, but simply continues, day after day, until one day you look up and realize the thing you were trying to build has the shape of something real. She worked from a rented desk in a co-working space. Her first client was a dry cleaning business owner named Henry Ramos who owned 4 commercial properties in the West End and had been meaning to restructure his lease agreements for 3 years and hadn't gotten around to it. He had known Eduardo Torres since the 80s. He called Nadia because Eduardo had mentioned she was in the business, and because the other firms he had contacted had quoted him prices that made him feel like he was paying for their offices as much as their advice. Nadia charged him less than half of what Hargrove and Wills would have charged and did the work with more attention than Hargrove and Wills would have brought to it. Henry Ramos told 2 people. Those 2 people told others. By the end of the 2nd year, Nadia had 11 clients, a revenue base of $412,000, and a part-time assistant named Diana who had been with her so long and knew the business so thoroughly that Nadia sometimes thought of her not as an employee, but as a second set of eyes she had grown. She moved into the 14th floor office in the spring of the 3rd year. She had looked at 11 spaces before she chose it, and she had chosen it for the eastern light, and for the conference room with the mahogany table she had bought secondhand from the law firm that was downsizing. The table with the watermark near the far end from the water glass left during the meeting when the client nearly walked and Nadia talked for 2 hours and the client stayed. She had done that alone. The talking, the 2 hours, the client staying. She had done almost everything in those first years alone, or nearly alone, with Diana and with occasional contractors when the workload exceeded what the 2 of them could manage, but alone in the sense that every decision, every strategy, every risk calculated and taken had been hers. This was not something she talked about. She was not a person who required an audience for her own history. She knew what had been built, and she knew what had been required to build it, and she carried that knowledge the way her father carried his ledger, privately and precisely, not as a boast, but as a record. By the end of year 5, Meridian Partners had 17 full-time employees, a client base spanning 3 states, and an annual revenue just under $3 million. Nadia was 34 years old, and for the first time since the company's founding she had begun to feel, not complacent. She was constitutionally incapable of complacency, but something adjacent to it. The settled sense that the thing you have been building is no longer in danger of falling over if you look away for an afternoon. It was in that relative stillness that she met Marcus. His full name was Marcus Calloway, and he was 40 at the time. A commercial banker who had spent 15 years at a regional firm and had recently left to consult independently, which in the world Nadia moved in meant he was between larger things and taking meetings to figure out which direction the next larger thing would come from. He was introduced to her at a commercial property development conference in Columbus by a mutual contact who thought they might have business interests that aligned. They sat next to each other at a panel lunch and talked for 2 hours, well past the point where the panel had ended and the room had mostly emptied, and Nadia had found herself, by the time the wait staff began resetting the tables around them, in possession of something she had not often had in the years since she started the company. A conversation that did not require her to explain herself from the beginning. He knew the business. He understood the language of it, not at the level she did, but enough to ask questions that were the right questions and to listen to the answers with the quality of attention that told her he was genuinely taking them in rather than waiting for his turn to speak. He was funny in the specific way of intelligent people who have spent enough time being taken seriously that they feel free to not be serious for stretches. He had a directness she respected. He had the kind of confidence that did not need to make itself felt in a room before it could settle in and do its actual work. She had not been particularly looking for a relationship. She had not been particularly not looking for one either. She had been, for the past 5 years, oriented primarily toward the company, and the company had required most of her, and she had given most of herself to it without resentment and without the particular loneliness that some people might have felt in that exchange, because she had always found in focused work a form of companionship that sustained her. But Marcus was interesting. He was the most interesting person she had met in a long while, and she was honest enough with herself to recognize that part of what made him interesting was that he found her interesting in return, not the company, not the revenue, not the trajectory of the business, but her, the way her mind moved, the way she thought about problems, the specific and unhurried way she went about deciding things. They were married 2 years later in a small ceremony at a garden in northern Kentucky. 37 guests. Her parents in the front row, Eduardo with his best shirt ironed carefully, Rosa with her hair done by Nadia's cousin the night before in a kitchen that smelled like food and candle wax, and the particular warmth of a family gathering around something that has finally arrived. Marcus moved into the building on Glenmore Avenue where Nadia had been living for 4 years. 6 months after the wedding, she brought him into Meridian. This had not been his suggestion. It had been hers, and she had made it after thinking it through with the same thoroughness she brought to every major decision. She had thought through the professional risk, the personal risk, the way that blending a marriage and a business created vulnerabilities in both that they would not have separately. She had thought through the equity structure, the title, the scope of his role. She had discussed it with Carol Shun, her attorney, who had raised all the concerns a good attorney raises and had drafted the employment agreement with enough precision to make the formal structure of the arrangement clear. What Nadia had not fully thought through, which she would understand better in the years that followed, was the subtlety of perception, specifically, the way other people's understanding of who ran a company could shift without any single decision being made, simply through the accumulation of small social adjustments that added up over time to something that looked, from a distance, like a different arrangement than the one that actually existed. She had given Marcus the title of managing director. It was a real role with real responsibilities. He was good at the things the title required: the client relationship management, the business development conversations, the external representation of the company at events and conferences, and the kinds of dinners where deals were preceded by several hours of being interesting in a room. He was genuinely good at those things, better than Nadia, who was effective in them rather than natural, who had learned how to work a room the way she had learned most things that did not come instinctively, through observation and practice and a careful study of what worked. Marcus did not need to study it. He arrived in a room, and the room arranged itself accordingly, which was a talent, a real one, and Nadia had always recognized it as such. What happened gradually, over the years that followed, was that the talent became visible and her work became invisible. And because Nadia was oriented primarily toward the work rather than toward being seen doing the work, she did not notice the shift happening until it had already happened. She noticed it first in small things. Clients who had known her for years began calling Marcus first, not because they didn't trust her, but because he answered quickly and warmly and left them feeling good after a phone call in the way that she was efficient rather than warm, and she knew it. She noticed it at industry events where she was sometimes introduced as Marcus's wife before she was identified as the company's founder, and she noticed that when this happened, people adjusted the weight of their attention accordingly, tilting toward Marcus and his easy confidence, and she let them because she had not come to the event to manage their attention. She had come because there was someone there she needed to speak with about a specific piece of business. She noticed it in the way the company's external materials began to emphasize Marcus's bio more prominently over time, a shift that had happened incrementally through a series of small editorial decisions during a website redesign, a brochure update, a press release template change, none of which had been a deliberate erasure of her role, and all of which had added up to something that looked, on the surface of the company's public face, like a business that Nadia Calloway ran. She had talked to him about it once, in the 6th year of the company's existence and the 4th year of the marriage, over dinner at the kitchen table on a Tuesday night. She had said it plainly, not angrily, because she was not angry. She was observant, that she had been noticing the shift in how the company was presenting itself, and that she wanted to make sure it reflected the actual structure and not a version of the structure that had drifted into place without anyone deciding it should. Marcus had listened. He had agreed that the drift was real. He had said it was not intentional, which she believed, and said he would address it, which she also believed, and for a time he had. There had been a period of months when the balance adjusted, when he made a point of crediting her specifically in client meetings, when the external materials were revised to more accurately represent the founding and the structure. And then the adjustment had gradually, without drama or declaration, drifted again. And she had not brought it up a second time, partly because there were always more pressing things to address, and partly because she knew, in the honest part of herself, that a conversation about being seen and credited was one she found difficult to have, without feeling like she was asking for something she should not have to ask for. She had not built the company to be recognized for building it. She had built it to build it. The building was the point. So she had returned to the building and let the drift continue, and told herself it was not what mattered, which was true, and was also, in the way that true things sometimes are, not the whole truth. Avery Sinclair had been hired 14 months ago in October of the previous year, and Nadia had been the one to approve the hire. The posting had been Marcus's initiative, which was consistent with his role in business development, and the initial interviews had been his. But Nadia saw every finalist before an offer was made. She had always done this, for every senior hire in the company's history, because the senior hires were the ones who changed the culture, and the culture was not something she had ever been willing to hand over entirely to someone else's judgment. She had interviewed Avery on a Thursday afternoon in a small conference room on the 12th floor, not the main boardroom, a smaller room they used for internal meetings, with a window that faced north over the city. Avery had arrived 2 minutes early. She had a portfolio of business development case studies from her previous employer, a development advisory firm in Chicago. That was the most organized presentation material Nadia had seen from a candidate in 3 years. Not flashy, organized, specific, the kind of material that told you the person who made it understood that the quality of your thinking mattered more than the aesthetics of how you presented it. They had talked for an hour and 20 minutes. Nadia had liked her. She had liked her in the specific, unsentimental way she liked people who were good at what they did and clear about why they did it. Avery had a sharp sense of where opportunities were undervalued in the market and a thoughtful approach to how you approached a prospective client without making them feel like a target. She had asked Nadia 3 questions during the interview that most candidates would not have thought to ask. Questions about the company's long-term strategic positioning, about the balance between advisory work and the potential to take equity positions in developments, about what Nadia herself thought the company's most significant competitive disadvantage was. Nadia had answered all three honestly. She had offered Avery the position the following morning. For the first year, everything had proceeded the way she had expected. Avery built a pipeline. She was diligent and precise, and she produced results. She got along well with the team. She and Marcus worked closely together, which was both natural and appropriate given that her role was in business development and Marcus was managing director. Nadia had thought nothing of the closeness initially, because in a company the size of Meridian, where 31 people sat within one floor of each other and the organizational structure was flat enough that most people worked closely with most other people at some point, closeness was not unusual. She had begun to notice something different, something without a clear name, sometime in the summer. It was not a single thing. It was the kind of accumulation that a person who pays careful attention eventually reaches the end of and looks back at and sees the pattern that was there all along, that they had been registering as individual data points without yet assembling into a picture. Marcus started leaving the office later. Not dramatically later, not in the way that would have immediately required an explanation, but 15 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes an hour past the time he usually wrapped up and came down to catch Nadia on her way out, which had been a habit of theirs for years. She started finding his dinner cold more often. He stopped bringing his laptop home on Thursday evenings, which he had done for most of the marriage during the weeks leading up to quarterly reviews. He began using his personal phone more frequently for calls he had previously made on the office line, which she noticed not because she was watching him, but because the office line logs crossed her desk as part of the operational review, and she had an eye trained by 12 years of management to spot the things that had changed without announcement. She had cataloged these things without drawing a conclusion from them. She had cataloged them the way her mother cataloged numbers, looking not for what was there, but for what the pattern was trying to say. And then on a Saturday morning 3 weeks before the board meeting, she had gone to the office at 7 in the morning because December financial reviews required the kind of focused and uninterrupted attention that was difficult to give them during a regular workday, and she had sat down at her desk, and she had opened her laptop, and the screen had been showing Marcus's email account, open on the company's shared portal, which occasionally happened when two people used the same system and one forgot to log out. She had reached to close it. She had paused. There was a message at the top of the inbox, sent 11:38 the previous night from a personal email account she recognized only because the name attached to it was one she knew. She had read the first 3 lines before her brain fully registered what the words were doing. Then she had sat back in the chair. She had sat there in the quiet Saturday morning office for a long time. The building had the specific stillness of a weekend, the kind of stillness that amplified everything slightly, made sounds more present and silences more complete. The light through the east-facing windows was the low, early December light that she had been watching through those windows for 12 years. She read the rest of the email. Then she scrolled up and read the ones before it. She did not read quickly. She read the way she read everything, thoroughly, giving each line the weight it required, not rushing toward a conclusion she was dreading and not looking away from the conclusions that were already forming. When she was finished, she closed the laptop. She did not move for a while after that. She had thought, sitting in the December quiet, about the strange specificity of what she was feeling. She had expected, if something like this ever happened, to feel something she could name cleanly: rage, devastation, the clean and clarifying simplicity of a single emotion arriving in full force and telling her exactly what to do next. What she felt instead was something more complicated, something that had several things in it at once, the grief of a particular kind of betrayal, but beneath it, older and quieter, a recognition she did not entirely want to look at. The recognition that some part of her had been watching the drift of the past 4 years and had registered it not as something wrong, but as something incomplete, and that this morning was the completion of a pattern she had been assembling without knowing what the finished picture would look like. She did not cry. She was not a woman who did not feel things. She felt them with the same precise intensity she brought to everything. But she was a woman who had learned early that feeling a thing and expressing a thing were 2 separate acts, each with its own timing, and that the timing mattered. She went home. She made dinner. She sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table and listened to him talk about a client prospect in Louisville and watched him the way you watch something when you are seeing it clearly for what it is for the first time. In the 3 weeks that followed, She did three things. She called Carol Shun, her attorney, who had incorporated Meridian Partners 12 years ago, and who had been Nadia's first call for every significant legal decision in the company's history. Carol had answered on the second ring, because Carol Shin always answered on the second ring, and Nadia had said she needed an appointment that week, and Carol had heard something in the way she said it, and said she had time Tuesday afternoon. She told Carol everything on Tuesday afternoon, plainly and without editorializing, and Carol had listened with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 30 years in corporate and family law and had learned that the best thing you could do for a client in these moments was give them the room to be completely truthful before you said a single word of your own. When Nadia finished, Carol asked 5 questions. Then she outlined 3 possible paths forward with the specific legal and financial implications of each, and she gave Nadia the same advice she had been giving her for 12 years, which was, be precise, be patient, and do not make an irreversible decision before you have a complete picture. The second thing Nadia did was review Meridian's employment contracts, beginning with Avery Sinclair's. She reviewed every clause. She reviewed the equity language, which was straightforward. Avery held no equity and had never been offered any. She reviewed the termination provisions, which were standard and had been drafted by Carol's firm with the specific kind of clarity that left very little room for a dispute about interpretation. She reviewed the non-disclosure agreements, the conflict of interest clauses, the codes of conduct. She went through the entire document twice and made notes on a separate legal pad that she kept in the locked drawer of her desk, the drawer with the key she had never given to anyone. The third thing she did was go to work every day and do her job. She sat across from Avery at a client presentation on the following Thursday and said what she needed to say and listened to what Avery said in return and registered the quality of the work being done without letting any other layer of what she knew come to the surface. She attended a team strategy meeting on the Monday of the second week and sat in the same room as Marcus for 2 hours without giving him any signal that anything had changed. She reviewed the quarterly financial materials over the weekend before the board meeting and found them accurate and prepared a supplementary analysis that no one had asked for, but that would sharpen the board's understanding of 2 key portfolio positions they were due to discuss. She did not do any of this because she was cold. She was not cold. She did it because she had learned, from her father's Friday evening ledger and her mother's reading of the space between numbers, that the moment of clarity is not the moment of action, and that acting before the picture is complete is not decisiveness, it is waste. She had a complete picture now. She had been carrying it for 3 weeks. And now it was the 14th of December, 8:55 in the morning, and through the glass wall of the conference room, she could see the elevator doors opening on the 14th floor. Marcus walked out of the elevator the way he always walked out of it, with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who had never in his life been troubled by the question of whether he belonged somewhere. He had the blue tie she had given him for his 44th birthday last spring. He had the dark jacket she had taken to the cleaners herself on a Thursday 2 weeks before she found the email, because the cleaners were on her way and it had been sitting on the bedroom chair for a week. He was saying something to Paul Hendricks as they came down the corridor together, something that made Paul smile, and he was carrying his portfolio under his arm in the casual way that meant he had reviewed the materials, but not extensively. He came through the conference room door and said good morning to Claire Firth and Gordon Lee and nodded to Sandra and looked toward the head of the table. He looked at Nadia, and she looked at him, and she smiled, the specific and composed smile she had been perfecting for 3 weeks. Then he sat down, and Avery Sinclair adjusted her notepad slightly on the table beside her laptop, her shoulder perhaps 12 inches from Nadia's, and looked at her own agenda, and did not know, as the conference room filled around her and the morning moved toward the hour, any of the things she was about to learn. The board meeting called to order at 9 o'clock precisely, which it did because Nadia Calloway had been starting the quarterly board meeting at 9 o'clock precisely for 12 years, and one of the quiet, uncelebrated structures of Meridian Partners was that the things she set in motion tended to run on time. She did not call it to order loudly. She did not bang a gavel or raise her voice or make any theatrical gesture toward the beginning of things. She simply closed her portfolio, looked around the table, and said, "Let's start with the financial review." And the room arranged itself accordingly, the way rooms do when the person at the head of the table has the particular quality of authority that is not performed but simply present. Paul Hendricks distributed the quarterly summary packets. Gordon Lee put on his reading glasses. Claire Firth turned to the revenue page immediately, which she always did, which was the habit of a woman who had learned 30 years ago that the number on the revenue page told you more about the health of a company than any other single number in the report. Marcus opened his packet and looked at the cover page with the attentiveness of someone who is planning to look attentive. Avery had her own copy, already open to the business development section near the back, which she had reviewed 3 times over the past week because the numbers in her section were strong, and she wanted to be certain she could speak to every line when it came up. She had her legal pad beside her with the 3 lines of preparatory notes she had written before the room filled. Pipeline total as of close of Q4, new client conversion rate, projected Q1 opportunities. Clean, organized, the way she organized everything. She was not, in those first minutes of the meeting, paying particular attention to Nadia. This was something she would think about afterward, in the specific and uncomfortable way you think about the things you should have noticed sooner. She had attended 4 quarterly board meetings at Meridian. In each of them, she had oriented herself primarily toward Marcus, because Marcus was managing director, because Marcus was the one who had hired her and who had been her primary point of contact, because Marcus was, as far as Avery had ever needed to understand it, the person who ran the business. She had registered Nadia as present and as the company's named founder, and as someone with evident intelligence and a specific kind of steady authority in meetings. But she had registered her the way you register the reliable ground beneath you rather than the horizon you are actively trying to reach. She was not proud of this later. She was honest enough with herself to understand what it said. Paul began walking the room through the revenue summary, page by page. He was a methodical presenter, Paul. He had been Meridian's CFO for 6 years, and he believed firmly that financial information should be communicated in the order it was organized and not rearranged for dramatic effect. He covered the top-line revenue number, which was up 9% year-over-year. He covered the operating expenses, which had held. He covered the margins, which had improved slightly over Q3. When he reached the segment breakdown page, he paused and looked at Nadia. Not Marcus. Nadia. The commercial advisory segment came in 1.5 points below the Q3 projection, he said, which we flagged in the preliminary review. You wanted to address it directly. Nadia nodded. She turned to Gordon Lee and Claire Firth. The shortfall is attributable to 2 contracts we expected to renew in November that pushed into Q1. Both clients have confirmed. The revenue isn't lost, it's deferred, and both renewals carry rate increases, so the Q1 picture is actually stronger because of the delay. She paused. I can walk you through the contract terms on both if you want them now, or we can table it to the supplementary review I've prepared. Supplementary review? Claire said. I put together an analysis of the 3 portfolio positions that carry the most volatility going into Q1. It's not in your packet. I finished it over the weekend. I can distribute it after we close the formal agenda. Claire looked at her with the specific expression of a board member who has been pleasantly surprised by a level of preparation she did not expect. Please, she said. Gordon nodded, made a note. Marcus looked at the table. Avery, who had been following the exchange with the part of her attention she kept available for things that were not directly her business, made a small note on her legal pad that was not about pipeline totals. The meeting moved through the operational review and into the business development section shortly before 10 o'clock. This was Avery's portion. She had been waiting for it the way you wait for the part of a conversation where your contribution is required, with the low, steady readiness of someone who knows what they have to offer and is prepared to offer it cleanly. She walked the room through the Q4 new business results. 4 new client engagements closed, 2 of them referred from existing clients. 1 sourced through a conference relationship she had developed in September, 1 through a direct approach she had constructed over 6 months of careful cultivation with a regional developer who had historically worked with a competitor firm. The numbers told a clean story, a 16% increase in pipeline value over Q3, a conversion rate that was the highest of any quarter since she had joined the company. When she finished, Gordon Lee looked across the table. That conversion rate, that's meaningful. It reflects the quality of the relationships we've been building, Avery said. Some of these took 8 or 9 months to develop to the point where they were ready to move. It also reflects a targeting approach that was worth the discipline, Nadia said. The room looked at her. Avery brought a targeting methodology when she joined that the company hadn't used before. She had to wait for it to produce results before it would be visible in the numbers. Nadia looked at Avery directly, the clear and steady look she gave things she was being accurate about. The Q4 numbers are partially a function of groundwork she laid in her first 3 months, which was before anyone here could see it working. I want that on the record. It was not a large thing. It was a single sentence of attribution at a quarterly board meeting, the kind of thing that passes in a moment and is not the subject of anyone's extended reflection. But it landed differently on Avery than a single sentence of attribution at a quarterly board meeting would ordinarily land, because it was said by Nadia, and because of what had been building in Avery's awareness over the past 40 minutes. She looked at Nadia and said thank you, and she meant it, and she felt, underneath the thank you, the first cold edge of something she was not ready to name. The meeting continued. The personnel items were brief. An administrative review of the benefit structure for the coming year. An update on a lease negotiation for additional square footage on the 13th floor that Nadia addressed in 2 sentences with specific dollar figures that told you she had been in the conversation directly and not filtered through a summary. Claire Firth asked a question about the company's founder equity position, a standard governance question she asked annually, and Nadia answered it the way she always answered it, with the level specificity of someone who knows the answer without needing to consult any document. 63%, structured the same as it had been since the founding, with full voting rights on all material decisions. Avery wrote nothing on her legal pad. She was listening in a different way than she had been listening at the start of the meeting. Gordon Lee made a reference near the close of the meeting to a conversation he and Nadia had had on the phone the previous week about the Q1 positioning. A conversation that had clearly been substantive, a conversation that Marcus had apparently not been part of, a reference that passed without comment from Marcus in the manner of something he was used to rather than something that surprised him. And Avery had watched that, the small, unremarked shape of it, and had filed it with the other things she had been filing all morning. Nadia closed the meeting at 11:14. She thanked the board members, confirmed the Q2 date, and asked Paul to stay briefly to go over 2 line items before he prepared the final summary for distribution. People began to gather their things. Avery was the last to leave the conference room. This was not intentional. She had been organizing her legal pad back into her portfolio, and by the time she looked up, the room had mostly cleared, Marcus having left with Gordon Lee in the direction of the elevator, the two of them deep in a conversation about a development project in Louisville that Avery knew Marcus had been pursuing and that had nothing to do with the board meeting agenda. Paul was still at the table with Nadia, the two of them bent over a printed page, Paul pointing to a line item and Nadia listening with the focused stillness she brought to things that required precision. Avery zipped her portfolio. She picked up her coffee cup, which was empty. She said, quietly, not to interrupt Paul, "Good meeting." Nadia looked up. Paul did not. "Thank you," Nadia said, and for a moment the two of them held a brief, unremarkable exchange of eye contact across the length of the conference table, the kind that happens dozens of times a day between colleagues who occupy the same professional space and have no reason to look at each other with anything more than ordinary professional acknowledgement. Avery looked away first. She walked to the door. She was in the hallway, 3 steps from the conference room, when she stopped. She stood in the corridor for a moment with her portfolio under her arm and the December light coming gray and flat through the window at the far end of the hall. She thought about what Claire Firth had asked and how Nadia had answered. She thought about Paul looking at Nadia, not Marcus, when the segment shortfall came up. She thought about Gordon Lee's reference to the phone call. She thought about 14 months of board meetings and client presentations and strategy sessions. She thought about who talked and who deferred and who waited and who was always already at the table before the meeting started. She walked to her office. She sat down. She opened her laptop and navigated to the company's internal document portal, the one that held the organizational governance files she had been given access to when she joined, but had never gone through with any particular attention because her job was business development and the governance files were not germane to her job. She pulled up the corporate structure document. She read the founding section. She sat back in her chair. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She read it again, more slowly. Meridian Partners, LLC. Founded March of the company's founding year by Nadia Torres, subsequently Nadia Calloway upon marriage. Majority equity holder, Nadia Calloway, 63%. Authorized signatory on all financial instruments, payroll accounts, tax filings, and binding contractual agreements, Nadia Calloway. She scrolled to her own employment contract. She had signed it 14 months ago at a desk in the HR suite on a Tuesday afternoon, a stack of papers she had reviewed that evening but not, she understood now, with the attention she should have brought to certain specific clauses. The contract was between Avery Sinclair and Meridian Partners, LLC, represented by its founder and majority equity holder, Nadia Calloway. The signature at the bottom of every page, the one authorizing her employment, her compensation, her benefits, her annual review, the signature she had looked at briefly and filed away as institutional formality, was Nadia Calloway's. She sat at her desk in the December morning and she understood, in the specific and irreversible way that you understand things you should have understood earlier, who she had been sitting beside for the past 14 months. The woman Avery had been thinking of as Marcus's wife had been signing her paychecks since the day she arrived. She closed the portal. She turned to her window, which faced north over the city, over the low December skyline and the gray Ohio River in the middle distance. She sat with what she was holding for a long time, which was not just the fact of the contracts or the governance documents, but the larger shape that the morning had assembled around it, the shape of a woman she had been looking at without truly seeing, a woman she had cataloged as a background presence in a story whose main figure she had gotten entirely wrong. She thought about the board meeting. Nadia correcting the segment shortfall before Gordon Lee could ask about it. Nadia with the supplementary analysis she had finished over the weekend. Nadia crediting Avery's targeting methodology in front of the board, specifically and without prompting, when she did not have to, when Avery had given her no particular reason to. That was the thing that sat most strangely. The credit. Nadia had looked across the table and credited her work, had made a point of putting it on the record, and she had done it knowing whatever she knew. Avery did not know yet what Nadia knew. But the morning had given her enough to understand that the picture she had been carrying of this company and the people in it was not the accurate one, and that the gap between the picture she had and the one that was true was significant. She opened a new document. She stared at it. She closed it. She sat at her desk for a while longer, and then she got up and went to make coffee she did not need, because sometimes what you need is the motion of doing something ordinary while you figure out what to do with the thing you're not ready to do anything about yet. Carol Shin arrived at Meridian Partners at 1:15 in the afternoon. This was not publicly announced, which was common enough when the company's attorney came in for working sessions. Carol's firm was 3 blocks away, and she and Nadia had had working sessions in the Meridian offices regularly enough over 12 years that her presence in the building, when it occurred, did not read as anything unusual. She came through the lobby, exchanged a brief greeting with the receptionist, and walked directly to the office at the southeast corner of the floor that had been Nadia's since the first year they occupied the building. Nadia had the door closed. She opened it when Carol knocked, which Carol did twice and precisely. The knock of a woman who had been practicing efficiency for 30 years and had gotten very good at it. They sat across from each other at the small table Nadia kept in the corner of her office for working sessions, not the formal meeting table, the smaller one with 2 chairs and a surface just wide enough for the documents they needed between them. Carol opened her briefcase and laid 3 folders on the table and a legal pad of her own. "The financial analysis is complete," Carol said. "I had my associate finish the valuation yesterday. I'll want you to review the methodology before we proceed." "I've reviewed the last 12 years of audited financials myself," Nadia said. "I know what the company is worth within a reasonable range." "I know you do," Carol said. "But I want a formal valuation before we file anything, because the number needs to be defensible and I want it to come from an independent source." She paused. "We're not in a hurry." Nadia looked at the folders. "I know we're not. Tell me where we are." Carol told her. The picture Carol laid out over the following 40 minutes was one Nadia had been building in pieces for 3 weeks, but hearing it assembled completely was different from having assembled it herself. It had the quality of something that had moved from theory to structural reality, from a private and provisional understanding to a formal account that could stand the weight of a legal process. The company's equity structure was clean. 63% to Nadia, 35% to Marcus under the employment agreement negotiated when he joined, with 2% held in a reserve pool that had never been distributed. The employment agreement governing Marcus's role as managing director was a separate instrument from his equity stake, which meant the two things could be addressed separately, which was relevant. The personal financial picture was more complex. They had a marriage of 8 years, joint accounts that had been funded in proportions that the bank records documented clearly, a house that had been purchased 6 years ago primarily from Nadia's income, which the mortgage records also documented clearly. Carol had been through all of it. She had a summary. The summary was precise. The main question, Carol said, is what you want the outcome to look like. Not the legal outcome. You know what the legal outcome looks like. What you want the actual situation to look like when it's resolved. Nadia was quiet for a moment. Outside her office window, the December afternoon had gone from gray to a heavier gray that sat just above rain and had not yet decided to commit to it. I want the company to continue, she said. I want the people who have built it with me to still have jobs and to still be doing the work they've been doing. I want the damage to be to the people who made choices and not to the people who just happened to be standing nearby. Carol made a note. And Marcus? Marcus has 35% of an equity stake that he didn't build. He has a job title and a salary and a room full of people who think he runs a company that I founded with my grandmother's money. She looked at the folders on the table. He can keep the equity he's entitled to under the agreement. He can keep everything he's entitled to. But what happens next should reflect what is actually true about this company, not the version of it that drifted into place without anyone deciding it should. Carol looked at her. And the employment question? Nadia was quiet for a moment. That depends on things I don't have answers to yet. She did not say Avery's name. Carol, who had been her attorney for 12 years and had sat across from her at enough tables to understand the shape of what was not said as clearly as what was, did not ask her to clarify. She made a note on the legal pad and moved to the next item. They worked through the afternoon. There were 31 people who worked at Meridian Partners full-time, and Nadia knew each of them the way you know people you have worked alongside through the specific weather of a company's actual life. Not just the professional exteriors they brought to meetings and performance reviews, but the fuller versions that emerged across years of shared pressure and ordinary days. She knew which ones were putting children through school, and which were supporting parents, and which had been through divorces, and which had health situations they managed quietly on the side of the work they showed up to do every day. She knew this not because she had made a formal study of it, but because she paid attention, the same attention her mother had paid to the numbers between the numbers, and because she had understood from the beginning that a company was not a structure. It was a collection of people who had chosen to put a portion of their lives into the same endeavor, and that the person at the head of the table owed them the courtesy of knowing what that cost. Diana Reeves had been with her since year 2. She was 53 now, with grandchildren she talked about with the easy warmth of someone who had found the part of life that made the rest of it make sense. She had been Nadia's first hire, her part-time assistant, and was now the office manager who ran the operational infrastructure of the company with the quiet and comprehensive authority of someone who knows where everything is and why it's there. She had been Nadia's first call on the Monday after the Saturday in December when Nadia had read the email, not for the purpose of disclosing anything, but because Diana was the person who made the operational machinery of the company run, and Nadia needed to know, without explaining why she needed to know, that the machinery was solid. Diana had told her it was. The machinery was always solid. Diana had made it her particular professional mission for 20 years. Paul Hendricks had been hired in year 6 from a regional accounting firm, where he had spent 9 years being more careful than his clients required and more meticulous than his colleagues appreciated. He had come to Nadia through a referral from Carol Shun, who had worked with Paul on a corporate matter and thought he was the kind of CFO that small companies needed and rarely managed to recruit before someone larger noticed them. He was 51, methodical, honest with an almost inconvenient thoroughness, and he had the specific loyalty of a person who has found the professional environment that actually suits them and understands what it costs to find it. He did not know what Nadia was carrying. She had not told him, but she had spent the 3 weeks since the Saturday morning keeping a particular eye on the numbers, making sure that nothing in the company's financial structure was being affected by something she did not know about, and everything Paul had produced for the quarterly review had been clean. The 31 people at Meridian Partners had not done anything wrong. Most of them did not know the shape of what was happening in the marriage at the top of the company. because Nadia and Marcus had been careful in the office, had always been careful in the office, and the professional composure that Nadia brought to everything had not slipped sufficiently in the past 3 weeks for anyone to read it. She thought about them, sitting at her desk in the late afternoon with the folders Carol had left and the legal pad with its notes, the ones that represented the 3 weeks of careful preparation she had given this. She thought about what she owed them, not in the abstract, not as a managerial principle, but specifically, Diana and her grandchildren, Paul and his meticulous honesty, the 7 people on the business development team who had signed on, in one form or another, because of Avery's work and the energy she had brought to the floor. She would not blow up the company to address what was wrong in the marriage. She had decided this in the first hour of the first Sunday after the Saturday, sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light with a cup of tea she had not drunk. The company was not the marriage. The company was 31 people who had given years of their lives to building something that was not defined by her husband's choices, and it would not be destroyed by them either. What would change was not the company, but the story the company told about itself. The story of who had built it. The story of who ran it. The story that had drifted, without anyone deciding it should, into something that looked, from the outside, like Marcus Calloway's company, rather than the company that Nadia Torres had built with $47,000. 3 years of 80-hour weeks, and the specific and inherited stubbornness of a woman raised to do things properly or not at all. That story was going to change. It was going to change in the way that true things change when the corrections are made. Not explosively, not with the spectacle of destruction, but with the quiet and lasting force of accuracy. At 5:47 in the afternoon, the Meridian Partners floor was mostly empty. The shorter days of December had a way of clearing an office faster than other months, the early dark combining with the end-of-year urgency to push people out the door before the city's last light was gone. Paul had left at 5:15, as he usually did, because Paul Hendricks had a 40-minute commute and a wife who cooked dinner and believed in eating it at a reasonable hour, both of which he treated as obligations worth keeping. Diana had left at 5:30. The business development team had largely cleared out by 5. Avery Sinclair's light was off. Nadia had heard her leave sometime after 4. A quiet departure with none of the usual end-of-day conversation she sometimes exchanged with the people near her office, which was itself a small piece of information. Marcus was still in the building. She knew this because his light was on, and because she had the particular awareness of where he was in a building that you develop in years of working in the same space as someone. An awareness so habitual you stop noticing you have it until the day you start noticing it differently. She closed the folder with Carol's notes. She sat for a moment at her desk with the December dark pressing against the office window and the city making its quiet evening sounds below. She thought about her mother at the bookkeeping desk in the corner of the dining room. She thought about her father's blue ledger, balanced to the penny every Friday. She thought about $47,000 and a handwritten note in Spanish and a conference room she had chosen for the Eastern Light. She thought about 12 years of work that had been done quietly and thoroughly and mostly without an audience. Then she picked up her portfolio, stood, and walked down the corridor to Marcus's office. His door was open. He was at his desk with his jacket off, his laptop open to what looked like an email, and the particular loosened at the end of the day version of himself that she had seen across 1,000 evenings in a marriage, at kitchen tables, and in hotel rooms, and on the couch on Sunday mornings, the version of him that had once felt to her like the most honest one. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway. His expression was the expression she was used to, easy and unremarkable and predicated on the understanding that there was nothing between them requiring unusual navigation. "Long day," he said. "Yes." She came in and closed the door. He looked at the door closing. A small adjustment happened in his face. Not alarm. Not yet. But the minor recalibration of a person who has registered a change in the texture of an ordinary moment. "I spoke to Carol today," Nadia said. She sat in the chair across from his desk, which was not the posture of someone who had come in for a brief exchange. "About what?" His voice was level. He had a gift for leveling his voice. She had admired it once. "About the company," she said. "About the marriage." She looked at him with the directness she brought to things she had already finished thinking about. "I found the emails 3 weeks ago, Marcus. I found them on a Saturday morning when I was in the office, and you'd left your account open on the shared portal." The room was very quiet. He looked at her. She watched the leveling of his voice become a different thing in his face, the effort of it becoming visible in a way it usually wasn't. He started to say something and stopped. He made a small motion with his hand that didn't complete itself. "I'm not here to have the conversation where you explain it," Nadia said. "I'm not looking for an explanation. I've had 3 weeks and I understand what I read." She put her portfolio on her knee. "I'm here because I think you deserve to know where things stand before they become formal." "Nadia." His voice had shifted. There was something in it now, a genuine quality she had not heard from him in some time, something that lived below the ease and the confidence. I want to explain. If you'll let me." "You can explain," she said. "I'll listen, but it won't change what I've decided." He looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in the early years of the marriage, with the real version of his attention rather than the practiced one, and she recognized it, and felt the specific and complicated sadness of recognizing something valuable in a person at the moment when the moment for it had passed. "What have you decided?" he said. She told him. She told him plainly, and without anger, and without the editorial inflection of a person trying to make a point land harder than the point itself could land. She told him what Carol had reviewed. She told him what the documents said, the documents that had always said it, the equity structure and the employment agreement and the financial history that she had been carrying for 12 years and that he had been, for the past 7 years, borrowing the weight of. She told him what she wanted, which was for the company to continue in a way that reflected what was actually true about it. She told him what he was entitled to, which was everything his agreement said and nothing more and nothing less, because she had not built a life in this company by being imprecise about what was owed, and she was not going to start now. She told him that she had not done any of this in anger. She wanted him to understand that, not because she was asking him to feel better about it, but because it was true and she had always believed that true things deserved to be said clearly regardless of how they were received. He sat very still across the desk from her while she spoke. She watched the expressions move across his face, the sequence of them, and she recognized all of them. She knew his face the way you know the faces of people you have woken up beside for 8 years, every version of it, the confident one, and the uncertain one, and the one that appeared in the quiet moments of the marriage when he was not performing anything for anyone, just being the actual person underneath all of it, which was a person with real qualities and real failures, and a specific and human inability to be, consistently, the person she had believed he was capable of being. When she finished, the room was quiet again. The December dark outside his window had fully arrived. The building had the stillness of a place where most people had already gone home to their dinners and their families. "You've known for 3 weeks," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. "And you sat in that board meeting this morning." "Yes." He looked at the desk between them and then back at her. "Nadia." He stopped. She looked at him. "I know what I've done," he said. And then, lower, in the voice that belonged to the quiet moments rather than the performed ones, "I know what I've lost." She held that. She did not dismiss it, and she did not give it more weight than it could bear. She had not come to his office to wound him or to be wounded. She had come because she believed the people you have loved, even when loving them has cost you something large, deserve the honesty of a real conversation rather than the efficiency of a legal letter arriving without warning. She had come because that was who she was, not because it was what the situation required of her, but because kindness, even at a table like this one, was not something she had ever managed to subtract from herself, regardless of what the table was about. "I know you do," she said. She stood. She picked up her portfolio. She was at the door when he said her name again, quietly and without the confidence that usually attended it. She turned. "I didn't think you'd tell me yourself," he said. "I thought I'd hear from Carol." She considered him across the room for a moment. "You've been in this company for 7 years," she said. "You should know how I handle things." She opened the door. Behind her, in the office that held 12 years of decisions she had made and 7 years of a marriage that had moved in a direction neither of them had intended, Marcus Calloway sat alone in the December dark and said nothing at all. She walked back down the corridor to her own office. She gathered her coat and her bag and the file she was taking home to review in the morning. She turned off her desk lamp. She stood for a moment in the dark of her office, the familiar dark of a room she had made her own, with the eastern windows that showed nothing now but the city's lights reflected against a black sky. She thought about tomorrow. She thought about what came next, which she understood with the same clarity she brought to quarterly financial reviews and client strategy sessions, the kind of clarity that comes from having looked at a thing from every angle until there was nothing left that you had not accounted for. She was not without grief. She had not made herself without grief. She had let it be what it was, and she had not let it become something that determined her choices, because grief was something you carried, not something you gave the wheel. She picked up her bag. She took the elevator down. She walked out into the December evening, where the cold had sharpened since morning, and the city was doing what the city always did at the end of a long day, gathering itself up and moving, all those lives in motion toward their separate destinations, each carrying something the others couldn't see. She turned toward the parking garage and walked. Behind her, on the 14th floor, the lights in the conference room with the eastern windows were still on, the way they sometimes stayed on past the end of the day, casting their long December rectangle against the wall. The mahogany table with the watermark near the far end was empty. The chairs were pushed back in the slightly irregular way of a room where work has recently happened. In the morning, the eastern light would come through those windows again at the low and precise angle it had always come through them. In the morning, a great many things would be different than they currently appeared to be. The formal legal process moved with the quiet efficiency of something that had been prepared thoroughly before it was set in motion, which was the only way Nadia had ever known how to approach things that mattered. Carol Shun filed the initial divorce petition on the Thursday following the board meeting, 2 days after Nadia's conversation with Marcus in his office. The filing was not a surprise to Marcus. He had known it was coming. He had been given the courtesy of knowing, which was one of the small and deliberate choices Nadia had made in the 3 weeks she had spent preparing for this, the choice to give him the information before it arrived through official channels, because she believed that whatever had broken in the marriage did not revoke the basic respect owed to a person you had chosen and lived with and known for the better part of a decade. He did not contest the petition. This was not resignation. Nadia understood it as the response of a person who had looked at the full picture that Carol's documents laid out and understood that the picture was accurate, and that arguing with an accurate picture was a particular kind of waste he was smart enough to recognize. What happened in the company in the days that followed was not dramatic in the way that company shakeups sometimes are. There was no shouting. There was no visible fracture. There was instead the specific and deliberate process of correction that Nadia had planned, administered the way she administered everything, with the patience of someone who understood that thorough was more durable than fast. Marcus came to the office. He continued to come for the 3 weeks it took to negotiate the terms of his departure from the managing director role, which were handled through Carol's firm and documented precisely. He was professional in those weeks, which she had expected. He was subdued in a way she had not entirely expected, not visibly subdued, not in a way that the floor noticed, but subdued in the particular way of a person who has lost a story they had been living inside and does not yet have another one. She recognized it, and she did not make it easier, and she did not make it harder. She gave him the same professional courtesy he gave her, and she met with Carol twice a week, and she kept doing her job. The floor noticed something eventually. Floors always do. The particular social intelligence of 31 people sharing a space and knowing each other across years of accumulated ordinary days is not easily deceived for long. Diana noticed first, which was inevitable, because Diana noticed everything, and because she had been watching Nadia long enough to read the difference between her regular composure and the composure that had something underneath it. She did not ask Nadia directly, which was its own form of loyalty, the loyalty of someone who trusts that what they need to know will be given to them when the time is right. Paul noticed the change in the volume of meetings between Nadia and Carol and the particular quality of the paperwork that began moving through certain administrative channels, and he kept his counsel and kept his numbers accurate and waited. On the 14th of January, exactly 1 month after the board meeting, Marcus Calloway left the building for the last time as managing director. He did it on a Friday afternoon, which was the schedule Carol and his attorney had agreed to, with a box of personal items from his office carried by himself without assistance, which was a choice he made and one that Nadia thought well of him for making. She was in her office when he left. She heard him exchange a brief goodbye with the 2 people who were still at their desks that late on a Friday. She heard the elevator. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the document on her screen that she had been working on for the past week and went back to it. Avery Sinclair came to her office on the Wednesday of the second week of January, 8 days before Marcus left the building. She knocked twice on the open door, which was how people who worked at Meridian knocked when the door was open and they needed a moment. 2 knocks, enough to be heard, but not enough to demand. Nadia looked up from the quarterly plan she had been reviewing and found Avery in the doorway with neither her laptop nor her legal pad, which meant this was not a professional visit, and with an expression that was stripped of the careful professional calibration Avery brought to everything, which meant she had already decided not to manage this. "Do you have a few minutes?" Avery said. Nadia looked at her for a moment. She thought about the board meeting, about the legal pad and the 3 lines of preparatory notes. She thought about Avery reading the governance documents. She thought about the empty coffee cup and the quiet departure on a Wednesday afternoon with none of the usual end-of-day exchanges. "Close the door," Nadia said. Avery came in and closed the door and sat in the chair across the desk. She sat straight, the way she always sat, but without the purposefulness that usually attended it. She looked like someone who had been practicing what she was going to say for several days and had decided somewhere on the walk from her office to this one to abandon the prepared version. "I read the corporate structure documents," she said. "After the board meeting. I read my employment contract." Nadia said nothing. "I've been at this company for 14 months, Avery said. "I sat across from you at a hiring interview, and I've sat in 4 board meetings, and I've been in dozens of strategy sessions and client presentations and team meetings. And I had a picture of what this company was." She stopped. The picture was wrong. "What was the picture?" Nadia said. Her voice was the same voice she used in board meetings, level and specific, asking a question she wanted answered accurately. Avery was quiet for a moment. "I thought Marcus ran it," she said. "Not that you weren't involved. I knew you were. But I thought it was primarily his. I thought your role was," she stopped again. "I thought you were a presence rather than the thing itself." "A lot of people thought that," Nadia said. "It's not an unusual mistake to make from the outside." "I wasn't on the outside," Avery said. "I worked here. I should have looked more carefully." "Yes," Nadia said simply. "You should have." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the January morning was bright in the specific way of cold, clear days, a high pale blue sky over the city, the kind of light that showed you everything. "I want to say something," Avery said. "And I want you to know I'm not saying it to manage the situation. I'm not saying it because I'm worried about my job. I'm saying it because it's true and because you deserve to hear it from me directly." "Say it," Nadia said. Avery met her eyes. "I'm sorry. For what I was part of. For what I didn't see, and for what I chose not to look at." She held Nadia's gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided the minimum they owe the person across from them is not looking away. "I knew something was not right. Not the full picture, not the shape of it, but something. And I looked at the work instead. Because the work was going well, and because I let what I wanted to be true override what I should have been paying attention to." Nadia looked at her for a long moment. She had thought about this conversation. She had thought about it in the same thorough way she thought about everything consequential, turning it over, looking at it from its various angles, considering what she wanted to come from it. She had thought about the versions of Avery she might find in this chair. The version that deflected. The version that made herself the victim of other people's choices. The version that calculated what she could preserve by appearing to be honest. The version that was actually sitting in the chair was not performing. Nadia had been reading people her whole professional life, and she knew the difference between performed honesty and the real kind. And the real kind had a specific quality, an absence of the small protective adjustments that performed honesty makes. What Avery had said had none of those adjustments. "I know," Nadia said. And then, because it was true and because she had decided in those 3 weeks that her own conduct through this would not be determined by anyone else's, the work was real. The results you produced were real. Whatever else was happening, those things were accurate. Avery was quiet. "The pipeline you built is worth $16 million in forward contracts," Nadia said. "That doesn't change because of other choices you made. I'm not going to pretend it does, because that would be inaccurate, and I don't do inaccurate things to make a point." "Nadia." Avery's voice was lower now. "You credited my work at the board meeting. You know I know what that means. You knew, already, when you said it." "Yes," Nadia said. "Why?" Nadia looked at her steadily. "Because it was true. And because I didn't build this company by letting what is true get managed around what is convenient." She paused. "The credit belonged to the work." The work belonged to you. Those are separate from everything else. Avery sat with that. What happens now? She said finally. To my position. That depends on you, Nadia said. Not on me. On whether you can do the work here and do it with the kind of integrity it requires. I'm not offering absolution for that decision. I'm saying it's yours to make. You'd keep me on. I said the decision is yours. I didn't say it would be uncomplicated. It would be complicated for a period of time, and then it would be either what it was or something you decided it couldn't be. She looked at the window. I've found that complicated things become clearer if you stay in them rather than withdrawing. She paused. That's not advice. That's just what I've found. Avery did not respond immediately. She sat in the chair across the desk from the woman who had built the company she had been working in for 14 months, whose name was on every document that constituted the legal reality of her professional life here, whose grandmother's money had seeded the thing that was now paying Avery's rent and her student loans and the car note she managed on the 3rd of every month. She sat with all of it, and she did not try to reduce it to a simpler shape than it actually had. I'll stay, Avery said. If that's still a real option. It's a real option, Nadia said. Avery nodded. She stood. She was at the door when Nadia said, not cruelly, not with emphasis, just accurately. Read everything you sign, Avery. From now on. All of it. Avery turned. She looked at Nadia for a moment with an expression that had no performance in it at all. I will, she said. She went out and closed the door behind her, and Nadia sat at her desk in the January light and let the room settle back into its ordinary quiet. She told the team on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of January, gathered in the large conference room on the 14th floor, all 31 of them. She did not tell them all of it, because not all of it was theirs to have. She told them what was relevant to their working lives and their understanding of the company they came to every day. That Marcus Calloway had departed from his role as managing director, that the company was continuing under its original operational structure, that she was taking on the public-facing responsibilities his role had carried in addition to her existing responsibilities, and that nothing about the work they were doing or the clients they served or the company's direction was changing. She told them, plainly and briefly, and she did not dress it in the language of corporate transition that was designed to keep everyone calm by telling them nothing. She used the specific and grounded language she had always used for things that mattered, the language that treated the people she was speaking to as adults who deserved the actual information rather than a managed version of it. When she finished, she asked if there were questions. There were a few practical ones about client communication and about the business development pipeline and about what the announcement would look like externally. She answered each one directly. She said she would be making personal calls to their 10 largest clients over the following 2 weeks to introduce the change and confirm continuity. She said the external announcement was being prepared and would go out the following Monday. She said the work continued. Paul Hendricks was looking at her with the expression of a man doing rapid mental accounting, not of money but of the fuller picture of the company's structure, putting things in order that had not been in order before, and finding, she suspected, that the new arrangement made a certain kind of structural sense that the previous one had not quite had. Diana was looking at her from the second row with the expression of a woman who had known her for 20 years and who understood without needing the missing information what the last 6 weeks had cost, and who had decided to express this, in the way Diana expressed most things, by saying nothing at all, which was its own complete communication. When the room cleared, Diana stayed. She waited until the last person left and the glass door closed. Then she stood and looked at Nadia across the empty conference room with the straightforward, affectionate directness of someone who has been watching you work for 2 decades and knows precisely what the work required. You doing all right? She said. It was not the question most people would ask their employer, and it was not the question Diana was asking as an employee. It was a real question, asked by a woman who knew the difference between the composed exterior Nadia brought to everything and what it sometimes concealed. Nadia considered it. I'm doing what I need to do, she said. That's not the same thing. No, Nadia said. It's not. She paused. Ask me again in the spring. Diana made the sound she made when she had heard something that was honest enough to accept, a brief exhale that carried a quality of recognition in it. In the spring, she said. She picked up her chair and slid it back under the table and walked to the door, and then, because this was Diana, and Diana always left with the last word positioned exactly where it needed to be. The company's always been yours. We all knew that. She went out. Nadia stood in the conference room for a moment in the January light. The external announcement went out on the Monday morning of the 4th week of January. It was a single page, which was the right length, drafted by Carol's firm and reviewed by Nadia, and revised twice until the language was accurate. It announced Marcus Calloway's departure from the managing director role and stated that operational leadership of Meridian Partners was returning to its founding structure under Nadia Calloway. That word, returning, had been Carol's suggestion, and Nadia had taken it because it was precise. Nothing was changing. Something was returning to what it had always actually been. The company's website was updated that same morning. The bio page, which had led with Marcus's name and photograph for 4 years, was restructured. Nadia's biography moved to the top. It was not a long biography, because she had never been interested in length for its own sake, but it was accurate and complete. It said that she had founded the company at 29. It said that the initial capital was a $47,000 inheritance. It said that over 12 years Meridian had grown from a single-desk operation into a 31-person firm with a client base spanning 3 states and annual revenues of close to $9 million. It gave the number. She had always believed in giving the number. Claire Firth called at 9:45 that Monday morning. She was one of the 3 clients Nadia had reached personally the previous week, and their conversation had been brief and good. The exchange of 2 people who had always understood each other. The announcement reads well, Claire said. Thank you. It says returning, Claire said. I like that word. It felt accurate, Nadia said. There was a brief pause. You know what I remember from the first board meeting I attended? Claire said. You had reviewed the materials before anyone else in the room. You had questions the other board members hadn't thought of yet. And when I asked you about the company's long-term positioning, you talked for 8 minutes without notes, and I didn't want you to stop. She paused again. I should have said that sooner. You're saying it now, Nadia said. I am. Gordon Lee sent a brief email that same afternoon. 3 sentences. The third one said, the company is in the right hands. It always was. She read it twice and then filed it in the folder where she kept the things worth keeping, which was not a large folder, because she was selective, but it was a folder she had maintained for 12 years, and its contents, read in order, told the true story of what had been built. On the 2nd Saturday of February, she drove to the West End. Her parents were in the same house she had grown up in, which Eduardo had bought in the year of her birth, and which he had maintained with the precise, ongoing attention he brought to structures he had decided deserved to last. The gutters were clear. The front steps were shoveled, because it had snowed the night before, a clean February snow that sat white and undisturbed. On the garden Rosa maintained with the same care she brought to everything. The kitchen window had the same yellow curtain it had had since Nadia was 7 years old, faded slightly from the years of afternoon light, but still there, still the same specific yellow her mother had chosen from a catalog in the early 90s. Rosa had made tamales, which was the meal she made when one of her daughters was coming home, and she wanted the house to smell like the kitchen had been expecting you. Eduardo was at the kitchen table with the newspaper, which he read in its physical form because he had done so for 50 years and had no intention of changing the arrangement now. He looked up when Nadia came through the door and held his arms out the way he had held them out her whole life, without preamble, without anything but the uncomplicated warmth of a man who loved his daughter straightforwardly and considered it one of the few things in life that required no complication. She sat at the table between her parents and ate tamales in the kitchen, where she had learned that numbers didn't lie and structures could be read if you looked carefully enough. She did not tell them everything. She told them what they needed to know, which was that the company was well, and that she was well, and that things had been difficult and were now resolving. Eduardo nodded with the gravity of a man who understood that resolving was its own form of good news. Rosa put her hand over Nadia's on the table and did not move it for a long time. She drove home through the West End in the February afternoon, past the park with the fence that still stood, past the library on Westwood Northern Boulevard where she had gone every Saturday as a child, past the block where the co-working space used to be before it became a nail salon, and then a clothing store, and then something else she hadn't tracked, past the beginning of the road she had taken to get here, which had been longer than most people knew and which had always been, from the very first step, entirely hers. Marcus kept his 35% equity stake, as the agreement specified. He moved back to the commercial banking work he had been doing when they met, with a firm in Louisville that he had been speaking with before the end of the year. Nadia heard this from Carol, not from Marcus, which was appropriate, and which she was not troubled by. She hoped the work was good. She meant this in the uncomplicated way that she meant most things, which was completely. Avery Sinclair stayed. This was not a small decision, on either side. The period that followed was complicated in the way Nadia had told her it would be, with the specific friction of a professional relationship that was carrying more weight than professional relationships were designed to carry, and with the intermittent discomfort of two people navigating a space that had been rearranged by the choices made inside it. There were weeks when the air on the floor had a quality that required more from both of them than ordinary work required. There were meetings that asked more of Avery's composure than she might have expected when she chose to stay. But the work was real. The pipeline Avery had built continued to produce. The Q1 results, which came in at the end of March, were the strongest of any quarter in the company's history. Avery put them together the same way she put together everything. Precisely, completely, with the legal pad and the 3 lines of preparatory notes before any meeting where they would be discussed. She had stopped bringing her coffee from the shop on the ground floor. She made it in the kitchen at the end of the hall instead, in the same small kitchen where Nadia made hers. It was a small change, unremarked upon, noticed by no one in particular. But Nadia noticed it, the way she noticed most things, and filed it in the part of her mind that kept account of the things that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. The conference room on the 14th floor was quiet on the morning of the first quarterly board meeting of the new year, the building not yet fully populated at 8:40, the winter sun coming in from the east at the low and honest angle it always came in at, laying its pale light across the mahogany table, across the watermark near the far end that had been there for 9 years, across the empty chairs arranged in their familiar order. Nadia came in at 8:43 with her coffee and her portfolio, and the supplementary analysis she had finished the previous evening, and she stood in the doorway for a moment the way she had stood in the doorway of this room on hundreds of mornings across 12 years, looking at the room she had chosen for the Eastern Light, because she believed that starting a business meant deciding what you wanted to face when the day began. She had faced it. She had faced it across 12 years of early mornings and late evenings, and the specific, accumulated labor of building something from nothing, of making numbers do what they needed to do, of learning the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. She had faced it across 8 years of a marriage and 7 years of a working partnership and 3 weeks of carrying knowledge she had prepared for a month before she set it in motion. She had faced the board meeting and the legal pad and the conversation in the December office and the box carried to the elevator on a Friday afternoon and the 31 people gathered in this room to hear what came next. She had not done it to be seen. She had done it because it was hers, and because things that are yours are worth the effort of protecting accurately, not defensively, not with the noise of someone who needs an audience for their own history, but with the quiet and lasting precision of someone who knows what is true and chooses to act accordingly. She walked to the head of the table and set down her coffee and pulled out her chair. The Eastern Light came through the windows the way it always did. Claire Firth arrived at 8:51. The way she always arrived, slightly early and already reading. Gordon Lee came 2 minutes behind her. Paul Hendricks came down the corridor with his reading glasses on and his manila folder and the resigned competence of a man who had decided long ago that the numbers told you the truth if you gave them enough room to. Diana passed the glass wall of the conference room on her way to the copy station and glanced in with the particular expression she wore when she was checking on something without making it visible that she was checking. And then she moved on because the thing she was checking on looked fine. It looked, in the Eastern Light of a January morning, exactly as it should. At 8:57, Avery came through the door with her laptop and her legal pad and her coffee from the kitchen at the end of the hall, and took the seat to Nadia's left and opened to a fresh page and wrote 3 lines. At 9 o'clock, the door opened for the last board member, and Nadia Calloway looked around the room and closed her portfolio and said, "Let's start with the financial review." The room arranged itself accordingly. It did what it had always done when she spoke. It listened. She had built it to do that 12 years ago, with eastern-facing windows and a second-hand mahogany table and her grandmother's $47,000 and the stubbornness of a woman raised to do things properly or not at all. The work had always been hers. The story had always been hers. Now it looked like it, too. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Kindness if you haven't already. See you in the next story.